A while ago, I ranked all the Pokemon in Pokemon Coliseum because I had just finished mastering it on Retro Achievements. Now, I haven't mastered XD, but I played through the actual main set, and I'm just in the post game, which I will talk about some of these post game potentials, but for the most part, we're going to be sticking to the mainline game with a few nods and acknowledgments to the end. But one thing I do want to point out is I had to reorganize this. They might be out of order slightly. I don't know why these are here, but I moved the stuff I wanted to talk about pretty readily to right there. But the first thing we're supposed to start with is the evolutions. I do want to point out Eevee is a valid option. It's not a great option, but if it was here, I would put it in C, which we'll talk about what these mean. S, I think, is like a team maker. Basically, you kind of form your team around maybe this Pokemon or maybe two of them, and you kind of go with what you have. A is they're very good in almost every area. They just get a little bit outpaced by the ones above them. You have B, which is middle of the road. It does great in almost every facet, but you are giving up something by, choosing to go with it. Maybe it's not really anything big, but you are giving up something. C is more of the same, except it's good in maybe 1 to 2 areas, whereas something would just be in general way better. And then D is just not very good, or it maybe is really good in one area but it's super hyper specific. That doesn't really matter. So let's talk about the evolutions first. If you don't know, you get an Eevee in this game versus the Espeon and Umbreon that you got in Coliseum, in which you can evolve into the 5 evolutions that are available in Generation 3. Now, of course, you have access to Flareon, which most people would consider the worst, Vaporeon, which a lot of people consider to be one of the better tanking Pokemon in the game. You have Jolteon on a very fast special attacker, Espeon, very fast special attacker, and one you should be used to with Coliseum, and Umbreon, the oddball here, because while it is a tank, it doesn't do a lot of damage. It doesn't do a lot of utility because of the TM usage in this game. It really is the odd one out, but we'll get into it as we go along with Flareon and B. Now, Flareon is easier to build a team around than Umbreon or even Vaporeon, in that while you could do a Rain Dance setup with Vaporeon, it's not getting the greatest boost out of it. Yes, water pulses are being boosted, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It isn't that great. Flareon gets the boost from not only Fire Blast being amazingly early, Flamethrower being easy to get, but Sunny Day also being much more prominent in a usable team. You have Chlorophyll being almost everywhere. You have a lot of Sunny Day users that get bonuses with access to Flamethrower, and overall, Flareon is usable. I don't think it's the best fire type by a long shot. You're giving up the amazing capabilities of Houndour, Growlithe into I said almost Infernape, into Arcanine with Flash Fire or Intimidate is a very usable thing. And even such things as Magmar have a lot more usable cases. Rapidash is also one off the top of my head that is pretty good, along with Vulpix. They're kind of in the same tier, but you are giving up access to those three if you kind of want to, have a fire type. If you want double stack, go ahead, but overall, I try and avoid it. Which goes into Vaporeon. Now, Vaporeon, it's very hard to say whether it's A because of the weak water pulses, or S because of just the tankiness, Ice Beam and Bite being great, and I do mean great moves to have. But I'm going to put it at the bottom S. Not only is it one of the better water types in the game, it's downright one of the most usable evolutions in the early, mid, and late games. Each evolution does have a suffer point for the entire game, and I feel like Vaporeon doesn't have that. Yes, the end of the game, it feels a little weak, but because it's able to throw out ice beams, it's able to throw out bites and water pulses, it can cover a lot, and I do mean a lot of different facets of Pokemon typings. It's not always going to be doing like amazing damage like the next two, but it is going to be throwing out damage, and maybe you can do some stalling stuff with it as well. It's perfect to throw Protect on. It has a lot of health. You get access to 2 leftovers quite readily in this game, meaning that is perfect to pair with it, which goes into Jolteon, which I do think is arguable to be one of the best. Now, you get access to Bite right away, meaning that you have a special attack that you can throw out with amazing speed. Thundershock is also going to be really, really close to when you evolve it, if not right away, depending on how you evolve it. And overall, you have two very strong special attacks right away. You get access to Thunder really quick in the game, which Thunder kind of sucks if you're not doing Rain Dance. 70% accurate is not great, but is really nice to have, which goes into Espeon. Now, it is arguable whether Espeon here is like as good as Jolteon. You could definitely make an argument for either, but my argument here is that with Jolteon, you're getting a very unique thing with very fast speed with electric attacks, whereas the only other electric type that I think is really spot on as being good is Mareep, which we'll get to, and Electabuzz maybe, because there's an argument to be made there. The other electric types are either too late or they're very weird in usability. Uh, there are, electric types in the game, but there aren't that many that are usable, and I do think Jolteon's very nice in that, whereas Espeon's really different. You have access to Baltoy very early in the game. You have access to wherever Ralts is, if I could find it, which Ralts is a great special attacker. Not only do you have more, like, coverage with a Ralts, being that you can teach a Thunderbolt pretty quickly, or do whatever. You have access to Calm Mind and a lot of other useful tools in the Gardevoir line, which kind of makes Espeon to me the less than stellar pick, but it's still amazing. And then we go into Umbreon. I'm going to be brutally honest, Dark types were kind of a rarity back in Coliseum, which brought Umbreon into great usage. And also at the same time, its tankiness was unique. But if you look at the roster we have here, tankiness is not that exclusive. And so I feel like it only makes sense to put it in bottom B. I do think it has some utility that is kind of missed out by a few of the other tanking Pokemon, as we'll get to it. But overall, I do think this is the correct choice. We have Teddy Ursa, which I do think is top of A. The only thing that kind of restricts it is it's kind of slow even as it evolves. And you are relying on return, which if you're early on and you get kind of taken apart, it might be too low power to get the big hits early on. I do think it's one of the best Pokemon to kind of throw in your second slot, especially since it's the first capture you get, meaning it's perfect for, just having two Pokemon right away. But there are some restrictions to it. It is also limited to normal fighting moves with a few other things. It's great. I'm not going to sit here and say it's not almost S tier, but there are some stuff playing it back. We have Poochyena into Mightyena specifically. I mentioned that. It also has that Dig and Poison Fang on Purification, which aren't nothing, but they aren't fantastic. I will actually be putting it at the bottom of B for Intimidate reasons. If you get Intimidate on Mightyena, it becomes very usable, especially in a double battle centric game. But yeah, there's that one. We have Ladybug into Ladian, which the only reason this is really amazing is you have access to weather TMs, Light Screen Reflect, Baton Pass, great utility Pokemon. There's a lot better options for it, but it does have a great use. Plus, it has access to Aerial Ace right away, meaning it throws out a 60 power stab move immediately, and for a bug, it has a quick experience gain. It's very underrated and it's usable, but it does fall apart in the late game, which goes into kind of your first big roundup of the 6 different, different typing of Pokemon from the color squad you fight at the Cypher layer. We have Houndour into Houndoom, which I think this Pokemon is actually super, super good. I do think it suffers from being quite frail, its speed tier not being amazing, and basically being required to be given a fire move TM, because Flamethrower for it in its learn set is far too late, and you're going to be putting Fire Blast on it. Feint Attack is also in its moveset for way too long. It has some weaker moves, but its special attack score is really, really high, meaning it could throw out pretty powerful moves, and Dark and Fire covers a lot of the bosses in the game. It's not great against some, but it covers a lot. And I do think it's very usable with Flash Fire. Early Bird also isn't that bad in certain situations. There's a couple sleep teams you'll come across. But Flash Fire is definitely the win here. It is definitely the fire type of choice if you want to go this route. I do want to say, though, it does weaken off towards the end. I don't think it's a great recommendation for post-game, but it is a great target for Earthquakes using Protect. and pair up with another Levitate. But yeah, we go into Spheal, which I think is actually a pretty good Pokemon. It does have access to Stab Water Pulse and Stab Ice Beam once it fully evolves. Of course, Thick Fat is a thing, and it has a pretty decent Body Slam attack. When it comes to tankiness, I do think it's in the higher echelons, and I do think as a water type, it's definitely one of the better ones. Problem is, it really isn't going to be your friend. I do think this is very hard to use early, and its learn set is very, very neutered. Yes, you get the purification stuff, and it's not that bad in that regard, but it definitely suffers until pretty late into the game on Dark Isle, which goes in Gulpin. I'm gonna be brutally honest. I think this Pokemon is very underrated. I will say that it's probably my favorite tank that is underutilized by a lot of people. Not only does it have access to Sludge Bomb in the game, or Sludge in this case, it has access to a bunch of utility moves such as Yawn, Encore, and just in general being able to maybe put up a screen. Maybe it's your weather setter. Overall, it is fantastic to have. I do think Gulpin as a Swalot is very underrated for XD specifically, which goes into Baltoy and Claydol. I don't think it's as good as Teddy Ursa and Ursaring. It does take a little longer to get going, but Levitate's good. Psychic Ground typing is amazing, though you're not going to be throwing out amazing Earthquakes with it because there's a lot other Pokemon that deserve the Earthquake TM, but it is definitely very usable. We have Seedot into oh god, what's the Nuzleaf into Shiftry, which you get access to a Leaf Stone pretty quick, but this also gets access to Fake Out if you wait a bit. Fake Out is an incredible move, and this also has a high enough speed tier where it's able to outspeed and do a lot of damage, has access to Giga Drain pretty quickly, and you don't even have to wait that long. I do think it is kind of neutered by its learn set, and it's not fantastic, which kind of makes it almost B tier. But I do think it has a great utility mon, as well as being a great attacker in a sunny day team, which is something that we'll get into like some of the weather setters. But overall, chlorophyll is a very powerful thing to build around, which goes into Mareep. I'm gonna be really honest. I think Mareep is one of the best Pokemon in the game. I kind of struggle to say whether it's above Espeon or below. We'll put it below for right now. Mareep goes into Flaffy very quickly, into Ampharos a little bit towards the end of the game, but by then you are throwing off powerful Thunderbolts or Thunders if you want to. It has access to Thunder Wave, which is a great thing for catching Shadow Pokemon. It also has Static, which, don't get me wrong, is not fantastic, but it's good. It's good for a lot of things. Now, when it comes to its speed tier, it is one of the slower Pokemon up here, and it'll probably be the slowest, I think. It does have a lot of problems in that, but Thunderwave support, along with a few other Pokemon that maybe can use some different stuff to boost it, can definitely go a long way. Now, we're going to go to here because technically this is after that with Lavrina, but Lavrina, whatever. We're going to jump around a bit. I do think Spinarak is pretty early into Ariados. It's not a bad Pokemon. It gets access to a decent set of moves. It's not great. It does fall apart pretty quickly, but I do think it's in the Ladybug tier. It does have a use, which is sometimes more than you can say about a lot of Pokemon. We have the eventual, or I almost said Camerupt, which is the next one we're talking about. But Sharpedo. Sharpedo is incredibly fast, hits very hard, and even though we aren't using a lot of physical attacks, 95 special will do a lot with water dark coverage. Now, the reason it's here is because it will just die. This Pokemon is just going to die a lot. It's not very good for a lot of the middle portion of the game because it just doesn't have the amazing moves. It gets access to Crunch really quickly, but even though it's throwing off a powerful Crunch, it's gonna more than likely take a hit from the other Pokemon it has to leave alive in a double battle. I do think it's great fodder for kind of throwing out a Protect and then throwing out a big hit, but it's very frail. It's not going to do a lot, which goes into Numel, into Camerupt. I've already mentioned this, but this has great usability on a lot of teams. I do happen to think is probably one of the top A tier contenders. The only weakness, of course, being without Sunny Day's support, is very weak to a lot of random Pokemon you'll come across. Water types, of course, destroy it. But you put Protect on it, it has access to Earthquake, it has access to Rock Slide, and then you can throw out Fire Blast or Flamethrower, depending on how you want, or you could even throw out an Eruption if you feel like it. Overall, it is a great Pokemon for hitting both sides of the enemy team. It also has great utility in being able to take a lot of different attacks. Camerupt isn't known for being a tank, but because of its typing, it's able to come out into certain situations and do incredible in this game. It's not to say that it's going to take everything. Water types, of course, murder it. Again, restating it, but it does great. Which goes into Shroomish. I do think Shroomish happens to be one of the better Pokemon that you can find early on. It sucks that Spore is locked behind, being like 54 in this gen, I think, or 45, whichever one have you. And then you have Breloom, which I think is a very powerful attacker. Too bad, of course, we're still in the original way typings work. Being that grass type moves are always going to be special. But besides that, it gets access to a lot of fighting type moves. It hits pretty hard, one of the better physical attackers. But I do want to state that there's a lot of flying types that are going to throw out a pretty quick kill on it. So it's not fantastic. And then we have, I think we've missed a few, but I'm going to go through as we go. I'm pretty sure, yeah, we definitely missed a few. But let's go with Delcatty. I think this falls apart pretty quickly, but there is something to be said about having a fully evolved Pokemon this quickly. It has great utility. It has a lot of different moves that I do think make it above these two barely. Normal typing isn't that bad in this game, but it definitely does fall apart pretty quickly. I do think once you're in the mid game, you see it struggle, and then late game, it's one of the worst Pokemon to pick. Because while the utility options are there, you might as well go with Ladian. Now we have the wild Pokemon that you can find. I do think Sandshrew is something to be said about a decent ground type. It does get a decent set of moves, but it's not going to be here because it doesn't get any good ground moves without a TM. So it gets to go here. Yeah, we're not going to talk about it. We get Gligar, which I think is somehow worse. Yes, it has a flying typing, and yes, it's pretty fast, but I do think it's one of the worst Pokemon to be found. Just don't go with it. Trapinch into Flygon is very good. It will be evolving pretty much at the end game, though, which means I do happen to think it's usable, but it definitely needs to be paired with the right party. I do think even Intimidate Mightyena has a lot more use, at least for the main game. Post game, it's hard to say whether it's amazing, but I do think Flygon would probably put it like top of B. But we have Hoppip, which actually great utility mon. This comes into being a fast sleeper, having the usability of, well, Chlorophyll, but at the same time, Leech Seed, you have access to a decent attack in Giga Drain. You have decent stuff in like Protect to kind of bait out Ice Beams. You have Reflect, Light Screen. Overall, the Jumpluff, one of the best underutilized Pokemon. Which goes in Fanfy and Donphan. Somehow, this Pokemon is barely better than Sandshrew into Sandslash. No idea. Zubat, Golbat, Crobat. Now, at first glance, this Pokemon is very hard to raise, but because you're in a double battle, it becomes a lot easier to kind of utilize. One, it's a flying type, which there's not a lot of good ones. We'll talk about some, but it does have a great typing, and at the same time, its Friendship Evolution is one of the best Pokemon in the game. Yes, it does get walled by Steel types, which is kind of a big problem, but it has access to Wig Attack, Sludge Bomb, Shadow Ball, Giga Drain, if you so happen to be inclined, and it can throw out a different other set of moves if need be. It's definitely one of those Pokemon that I think it can do amazing, but is definitely at the lower end of A. I do think it struggles way more in the early departments than the overall struggle of Sharpedo, but I do think its highs are way better. Plus, if you drop Jolteon and you didn't pick a lot of the other speed tiers, this is a great option. Aeron and Aggron, I think this is just okay. I there's nothing to really be said about how like good it is. It's a great physical attacker, has access to steel and not that many rock moves at all, honestly. And you could give it Earthquake, but the steel typing is the only reason it's here. It does get kind of trashed by fighting types and ground types, which there's quite a few of. But anyway, we have Masquerain, which, or Surskit into Masquerain, sorry. Intimidate is a thing, and I do think the flying type is amazing. It doesn't get a great variety of moves, but ignoring that, I do think it happens to be pretty usable. Wooper and Quagsire, I think this Pokemon's busted. Water Absorb into what is even a shitty water move into Earthquake into just being Quagsire. I don't think it's one of the best in the game, uh, but I do think is high up here. I do think it kind of needs a team to go around it. And of course, sunny day teams are not going to have it. Solar beams can be quite effective on it at that point. But I do happen to think it's S tier. I do think it spits out a little bit more utility than Camera Up with lower damage threshold, which, hey, it's not always a bad thing. Uh, I guess we'll talk about the trades. I'm going to be brutally honest. Shuckle is just not usable in this game. Uh, I do think Metacham has great utility as a traded mon, and I do think Tyranitar, while being cool, is always going to be here because even with the experience boost of being a trade, it kind of just falls apart. We go into Electrode, which I do think the speed tier is very important, but it's still Electrode. So it's going to take a little bit to evolve, and the speed tier isn't that amazing. Makuhito, which I happen to think is one of the best Pokemon in the game. We're going to put it right below Teddiursa because, one, it gets access to Fake Out. You give it Thick Fat, it's going to take a lot of damage. It hits pretty hard, and it just is a health sponge, which is perfect. Just perfect. Vulpix, which I do think is pretty usable. I do think is definitely below Flareon and probably at the bottom of B. Ninetales is usable, and there's a lot of strong fire type moves, but you're using Confuse Ray. You're not using a lot of great stuff. It does decent on the special attacking side, but as you can see, we got it covered. Duskull and the Dusclops. Pretty good tank, actually. The only problem is that it doesn't really do much else, and that's basically it. Like, it's just a really good tank. I do think it's better than Umbreon in this game, which is kind of weird, but I mean, Umbreon does have Taunt. Yeah, we're gonna move this lower. Um, we have Gardevoir. I happen to think that this is probably one of the best Pokemon in XD, if not the best. It's really arguable, but you get access to Ralts at level 20, which goes in Curlia, which isn't great, but with 10 levels, which you're at almost the end game at that point, not almost the end game, but you're dungeon before it. You'll be at Gardevoir, which you're throwing out powerful Psychics because level 26 Psychic is stupid, and Thunderbolt, which, hey, Thunderbolt is really good and easy to acquire in this game. And that's all you need. It has Calm Mind. It gets Hypnosis. What more do you want? Honestly, I think this is probably the best. Uh, yeah, Mawile. I mean, there's Hyper Cutter and Intimidate, Steel typing, but it's really, really, and I do mean really weak. This Pokemon falls apart pretty fast, and even though Intimidate is great, I do think it's actually just down here. Steel typing is amazing, but nothing more. Pineco into Fortress. I think this is easier to use in this game, but it's still very hard to get this bug Steel type to work. Snorunt, Glalie sucks. You get access to Ice Beam almost, not almost right away, but pretty quickly after you catch this, meaning that you have a powerful stab, but Glalie is not a great Pokemon. But it does get access to Ice Beam and a decent amount of different shit, so I would actually give it a lot of credit. I do think it's almost B tier. These two are almost in B tier. It just falls apart pretty quickly. Xatu, I think, is a very underrated Pokemon. It's definitely a decent speed tier, decent stats for tanking. Has Psychic as a usable move. Gets access to Aerial Ace thanks to, of course, Purification, and it's a good weather setter. Overall, it also packs screens. I think it gets Baton Pass as one of its moves. It's something to use. I do think it's very underrated, and it's definitely useful. Spearow and Firo. I think this Pokemon starts out insane. It's one of the best Pokemon you could pick up in the midpoint game, but it falls off so fast and hard. I do think it has a great utility option in just being a good flying type, which we've talked about. There's not a lot of good flying types. We'll come across some that are good, but it's the only like flying normal that I think is fantastic, and even then, I do think it suffers from not great learn sets, which we'll get into the other flying normal eventually. Roselia, without the evolution here, it's pretty weak, but it does have chlorophyll. It does have access to decent grass pool and poison pool, but it's actually not as strong as I would want. and the other grass types in the game are also pretty middling. It's just grass types are kind of cursed. So, I mean, we can kind of put it like here. It's not a great. It's it's better than C, but barely. Meowth it has pickup usability. Persian's really fast. It doesn't hit that hard. That's the problem. Is it doesn't do enough damage. Its speed is cool. It does feel a little better to use than some of these Pokemon in C, but that's because of a normal typing. It gets trashed pretty easily. Uh, Piloswine is not a good Pokemon in this game. I think it gets trashed too quickly. And in fact, I do think while its ground typing is amazing, its ice typing is what really punishes it for what would be the bosses in the late game. Grimer and Amok. I'm going to be brutally honest, this is very underrated as well, but I understand why it is. It takes a while to evolve it, and Sludge Bomb is amazing to have, but it's not going to carry you to victory. I do think it happens to be in B tier, though. Seal and the Dugong, we'll get into this, but besides like a few options that it has, I think Walreign's a little better. I do think this is decent, so we'll put it here. But yeah, Lunatone. If we're gonna be honest, it's pretty good. I think one, it has a Rain Dance already on it, which kind of sucks that it's weak to boosted water moves, but hey. It gets Psychic really early. It has Cosmic Power Baton Pass, meaning you could do some insane shenanigans, and it's just great for a lot of utility. Nose Pass, I don't really like this Pokemon in this game. It doesn't have a lot of amazing matchups. I happen to think it falls behind really quickly as well. Not great. Togepi, you get this. Togetic is just not good. It has utility, but I mean, we're talking really shitty utility. So, yeah. Zangoose. Really good physical attacker. I think it's actually up here. It does fall apart in the fact that uh, its speed is not like the highest in the game, and its actual physical attack offerings are either locked to a move tutor or just sticking with Crush Claw, which I mean isn't bad. I'm not gonna sit here and say it's like, oh, that's awful, but it definitely limits its functions. Elekid, you get access to trading and stuff, which it gets access to elemental punches, and you can do this quite early to like use it for the rest of the game, but you're stuck with a baby Pokemon trying to raise it. And while I do think it is better than the Electabuzz in most facets, you don't need Electabuzz to be better. Like, and it's very confusing. And you have the elemental punches, that's cool, but it's just you don't need it. Paris and Parasect, very underrated Pokemon for this game. I think Spore is super super valuable. Plus, its bug grass typing is actually surprisingly usable. Yes, it's not fantastic because of the flying fire weakness, but Spore is great. Growlithe, I've already talked about this kind of. I do think Intimidate Arcanine is very usable, and it's pretty tanky. It has a lot of usability. It's not the greatest fire type, of course, but hey, it's pretty good. We have Shelter, which in the Cloister isn't bad. Waterstone, it has access to Surf, one of the few Surf users, and I do happen to think it's probably the best in B tier. Physical tank, really good. Beedrill falls apart by the time you like fight the next trainer after you get it. I happen to think it's one of the worst Pokemon in the game. Pidgeotto, it evolves into Pidgeot pretty quickly, but you're still stuck with the Pidgeotto by this point in the game. I happen to think it's pretty bad. Butterfree, I do think is the worst option for a bug type. I do think even Beedrill has a little more usability, but they're still kind of the same. Tangela, it doesn't evolve here. It's very weak. It doesn't get a lot of use. Magneton, I think, is a very, very good special attacker. It's electric steel, meaning you put protect on it. You could throw out kind of a bait for earthquakes and do something back. It's Magneton. I do think that this is probably right here. Venomoth, it has Stun Spore, which honestly is all it needs to really be in top of B. I happen to think it's really, really usable. Uh, Weeping Bell and the I almost said Vileplume. Victory Bell. There we go. I do think I've actually used this quite recently for a decent amount of time. I do think besides the initial point you catch it, it does get a lot of standout moments. It has access to a very powerful Sludge Bomb. It gets Magical Leaf, which isn't great, but does allow you to hit, those rock ground types or even just the random water types you come across. It does decent. I don't want to see it's fantastic, but I did use it, and I happen to think it's up here. Uh, I am gonna play under Lunatone because I did end up using Lunatone and Victory Belt. Why am I so ugh? But I did use both, and I happen to think Lunatone did better. Arbok, there's Intimidate, but it's one of the worst Intimidate users. We'll put it there. Primeape, I think access to cross chop, its speed tier, and just being a pretty hard hitter means it's always going to be high up in B. But I happen to think it's actually under Sharpedo. Yeah, it gets fighting normal, but Water Dark is just much better coverage. It does hit a little harder in this case, but I don't really care. It's not as I like. I'd rather have Sharpedo for the coverage. Hypno, pretty bad. It just it doesn't hit that hard. That's the biggest problem. I mean, there's some shit you can do, but yeah. Golduck, I think Golduck is actually a pretty good water type. I personally think that it kind of falls apart by the link game, but besides that, I think it's pretty good. Sableye, I do think is really hard to use in this game. It's a great like utility mon, but it's better if you're going with a ghost type. It's better to go with like Bayonet for damage, Dusclops for tanking, and there's other Pokemon for the utility it gives. It is usable, probably better than Nosepass, but not fantastic. Raticate, Guts is fun, right? That's basically it. It's not fantastic. I do think it's bottom B. Dodrio, I talked about how Furo kind of falls apart pretty quickly. Dodrio also falls apart, but it takes a little while before it does. It does have a problem in that it's walled by quite a few Pokemon in the game, but its Drill Picks and Tri Attacks at this point are very powerful. Farfetch'd, whereas I already talked about Furo falling off, this has Swords Dance, this has some utility. I do think it's right here. You're trading power for utility, which there's something to be said about it. Altaria, this was one of the best Pokemon in Coliseum. Very underrated, underutilized. Here it kind of gets trashed because the teams are much more varied. Sorry, I almost said varietied. But uh, it definitely gets trashed a lot more by random ice beams, and it does come at a point where we're starting to. The levels are important. Kangaskhan, funnily enough, access to Earthquake and Dizzy Punch is all this needs to be fantastic. I do think it's not one of the best options in the game, but one, normal typing is quite tanky. Earthquake hurts, Dizzy Punch hurts. You can't go wrong with Kangaskhan, actually. I think it's very underrated. Beta, it's the best physical attacking ghost type, and that's kind of all it needs to really do anything. I kind of think it fits here. Pinsir, I don't think is actually that great. Yes, it's very physically bulky. It hits really hard, but it lacks a competent stab, um, and it's just not fantastic. I do think Reimer and the late stage Muck actually throw out more potential than Pinsir does. Magmar, I already talked about this kind of. I do think this is one of the better fire types in the game. It does come pretty late, which is why I will probably put it like right here. But it does have an amazing fire blast. It has the ability to learn psychic. Overall, Magmar is very good. Which goes into one of the worst fire types. This comes at a point where you are seeing earthquake a lot. You're seeing random surfs. You're seeing just random water moves sometimes and water pulse. You're seeing just too much rock type moves are coming out and rock slides. You're going to be fighting a lot of fighting types at some point. This is honestly one of the worst Pokemon. It does get access to Heat Wave, which would be cool. I would love, I mean this, I would love to be able to use this, but you get trashed so easily. Rapidash high speed tier is good enough to kind of throw it into what I would call the good zone of B. Like, it's not inherently strong, but it's definitely better than Mawile. Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee, I always prefer Hitmonlee, but in this case, they're kind of the same thing. We do get access to Mach Punch on Hitmonchan, which is something to be said, and they're kind of just okay. They're kind of with Golduck. I do think Hitmonlee's a little better, but they kind of fit the same mold, and they, in this case, it's better to maybe go with Bloom or Primeape, or even just stick with Brick Break on one of your normal types. Makuhita into Hariyama is also a better option. Lickitung, very underrated, but it's still like a normal type that doesn't get a lot. So there's that. Chansey, which is very hard to use in this game. One, Blissey takes forever to evolve, like forever, and two, like there's a lot going on in double battles. I think this is too hard to use to be fantastic. Scyther is okay. There's a lot of rock slides going on at this point, sadly. Starmie, I do think for post game, this is one of the best Pokemon, but because you get so late, it doesn't get off the ground that much. Um, but it is one of the best late game Pokemon to have. Solrock, unlike Lunatone, where it comes at a point where it's very, very good with Psychic, one, the rock slides of Solrock aren't as powerful as you would want, and two, while it does power up Sunny Day, or a Sunny Day team, it just doesn't have a great like move set to complement like the fire type itself. Yes, Rock Slide is great and all that, but what is it doing? Whereas Lunatone, if you want to do Rain Dance, you could do Rain Dance, uh, Psychic, Cosmic Power, Baton Pass, or you could just forego doing Rain Dance and do Psychic Ice Beam, Cosmic Power, Baton Pass, or whatever have you. There's options here, whereas Solrock doesn't get a lot. I do think as a Sunny Day setter, it's pretty good, but that's it. Swallow, Gut Swallow. I do think this is one of the better flying types. In fact, it's probably the best, but it comes very, very late to the point where, while I do think it's better than these two, it's still not great. Electabuzz, I already talked about this. I do think Electabuzz is very good late game. And while it doesn't get a lot of time to shine in the main story itself, I do think is very, very powerful. So I will kind of put it above Pinsir. Snorlax, you get leftovers from this, so you're going to catch it anyway, but it kind of comes too late to be usable. And Snorlax is one of the best Pokemon in the late game, so it's one of the like three Pokemon we'll talk about the post game being the big decision maker for it. I probably put it above Xatu. Plus, it gets access to Body Slam. So yeah, pretty good. Poliwrath, it's okay. That's basically all I have to say about it. It doesn't do anything fantastic, but it doesn't do anything wrong. Mr. Mime, very good. You have access to Psychic and Thunderbolt. We already talked about how it's very powerful in Ralts. This comes a little too late to be amazing, but I do want to say it is fantastic to have. Duck Trio, which powerful Earthquakes, fast, frail, comes too late. We will actually be putting this right here. Manectric, amazing. It has a lot of usability. Lightning Rod doesn't work as it does in later gens, meaning that some of the usability is kind of weakened, but it's fast, it hits hard, can learn a variety of different moves that are a little different from the normal electric types. Just comes too late to be a fantastic, but it's definitely the best Pokemon in C tier. Marowak. Now, a lot of people would be like, okay, this isn't good. You were wrong. I think Marowak is one of the best Pokemon for a late game. Yes, it's slow, but you have access to Swords Dance and Thick Club immediately, and that just does too much damage. It's one of the highest physical attackers in the game. Lapras, tanky, bulky water. It kind of falls apart, but I do think it kind of goes with Umbreon, mostly because post game usage is pretty usable. We have Salamence, which the post game usability on this with Intimidate is fantastic to the point where I would argue that you could wait for forever for your 6 slot to be filled, and this would be it. And I do think it's actually really, really good, even with how late it is. This is a legendary that is super, super late. In fact, we are in the final battle or past it. So, for usability, this doesn't get used a lot. I mean, like, you could use it in the post game material for Orc Coliseum, I guess. But even then, I do think there's other legendaries that do better in it. But yeah. Rhydon, I do think is just too late. Also, Rock Ground is just not great at all. Moltres, I do think it's kind of shat on here. It's not fantastic at all. Executor, I do think is a usable thing in the post game, but it kind of falls apart. I'm actually going to move Lugia up here. Tauros, I think, is also right here, and then Articuno, I think, is a little above these in being usable in the post game, but that's just me. And then we have Zapdos, which I do think is the better option for post game. It is amazing in that regard, but still kind of falls behind a few other things. Like Zapdos is amazing, but yeah, that's the way it be. We have Dragonite, which is the last Shadow Pokemon you have access to, but it is amazingly leveled. And if you're not going with Salamence, this is an okay third option. I do think there's other options in general that might be better to go towards, but I do think it is very, very good to pick. Quad Weak to Ice is a problem. We have the Johto starters, which you're going through Mount Battle, literally 100 battles in a row to get this. Not fantastic. for Blast Burn, Frenzy Plant, and Hydro Cannon. Yeah, there we go. Sorry for the click, but and that's it. That is the entire list. I think it's pretty good. I think I would like a physical attacker up here, but looking at it, the physical attackers are kind of dominating A tier. Um, I try to leave this as utility. As you can see, a lot of Pokemon are very usable because whereas like C tier, there's a cutoff point where C is like very hard to use. I still think it's usable even to like down here. So like you're not leaving out a lot of Pokemon in XD on like Coliseum, where Coliseum I was very quick to kind of be like you're useless, your use is covered by something else. Everybody kind of has a use in their own way in XD. It's really, really cool. It's nice to see in a sequel in that improvement. And overall, I happen to really enjoy the setup. Um, my favorite Pokemon personally to use in the post game has become Marowak. Marowak's just really fun. But yeah, I think this is pretty good. It kind of finishes off the tier list of Coliseum and XD. And yeah, cover something at some point.